So coming into the tail end of my practice today, I'm doing a little QDR work, and I thought, you know what, this would be interesting to share. Get a lot of questions about the QDR, about balance in general, and some common roadblocks that students face when they're working the QDR. I've faced many of the roadblocks myself, and I continue to explore and troubleshoot ways to work with, around, through, etc., to access more possibilities inside the QDR. If you're not familiar with the QDR, it's a side balanced or side leveraged elbow lever. And the QDR stems from, I believe originally capoeira, but you see it now in b-boy, you see yogis trying to do it, you see it in general hand balancing. I found it to be this meta pattern to help improve all balance patterns in some way. It definitely teaches center of mass over base of support very clearly. It's much different in orientation than a handstand based on how the load is distributed and worked with. And it, again, allows for eventually, for many, a transition inside of something like locomotion work. So some basic locomotion patterns using the QDR as a point of exit, for example. So it's a fun one. To be honest with you, that's why I continue to show up and do the QDR. It's fun, it's rewarding, and it continues to inform a lot of my balance work. I don't do a lot of hand balancing these days. I'm working on other projects, other skills. The hand balancing, I can go back to at any point, and it's still there. I do find that this elbow lever work, this QDR work, to be even more potent in maintenance of other balance work. So oftentimes, like today, at the end of my practice, I'll spend a few moments and just get a couple sets in. So the main things that I think about and the things that show up for me are starting from the ground up and working through sticky areas that, again, I'm thinking about my own practice, but what I often see in individuals looking to learn some of this material. Starting with the stickiness here in this ligamentous structure of the wrists, the hands, the fingers, the elbows, all of this gunky stuff that for many of us, I know for myself, I didn't grow up doing gymnastic work and spending a ton of time on my hands. For many of the students I work with, they didn't start a practice like this until their 20s and 30s, some even later. And so this structure has not been informed over the years to adapt to this balance loading and to have the balance of, let's say, all degrees of range of motion in the wrist, the hand, and the structure and balance within the forearm and the elbow joint. So it takes time to develop these layers. It takes time to allow this tissue to adapt and turn over, to really build a resiliency and a quality of tissue that allows us to practice safely. So with that, I do what I've done since day one, which is I warm up the wrist very diligently. Even if I'm not going to spend my time doing work on my hands for a particular session, I still warm up my wrists because, again, the information I'm putting in, let's say, is going to then determine the quality of the structure coming out. If I only do it once a week, I can't expect for that consistency to really give me any long-term change in tissue adaptation. So most of the research here shows 9 to 12 months for the tissue to actually renew. There's not a lot of blood supply, so it does take a little bit of extra tinkering with for it to, and patience, for it to actually translate into something that we can use without feeling like the wrists and the elbows are bumming us out. So I already did my wrist prep for the day, which is these 6 positions, 3 of which are hands, palms flat, hands forward, backward, and then rotated. The other of which is palms lifted or facing upward, let's say, all of which the elbows are locked. So I kind of play around with these different positions, long holds, making sure, again, just on a general movement layer, the wrists are ready to move. And then on the mobilization layer, building strength, finger push-ups, finger lifts, getting some reverse wrist strength work, making sure that I'm building that mobility or strength component to inform the ability to hold in these leveraged positions. So Every day. Every day. I even do this at the end of the session once I'm done. Again, the more, in some cases, the better for this ligamentous work, just because it needs a lot of attention and a lot of love. So the other thing with the QDR that often, again, I've done today a session full of kicks and some aerial work. I did some arm movement. So generally when I'm coming into this QDR work, I'll go through all the steps again, which is the very beginning of what I learned on the QDR, understanding simple placement. For some people, it might just be literally sitting in place, understanding where the elbow needs to go. It's going to vary depending on torso anatomical discrepancies. My torso is a little longer, so it comes a little, you could say, higher above the hip. For some, they may feel like they're right on top of the hip. The point is, you need to find a position that allows for this open external rotation, so it allows me to get the chest lifted, and it allows me to then stack that elbow vertically on top of the wrist. For most, it's just above this, this hip bone right here on this anterior side, but it's going to vary depending on the individual. It's not in here. If I'm limited in external rotation, often what happens is people will try to come into center. The problem with this is I can't actually rotate the chest and get open from here to find this stackable position, and I end up just facing the floor the whole time. This is an elbow lever, but this one, working this one, will not translate here. This one will translate here. So we want to get this externally rotated open position, chest up, and see if we can find this point of balance and stacking, in this case, the center of mass directly over the base of support, which is the elbow wrist. So for many, it's just, okay, do I know where that needs to be? The second layer that I'll go through is spending time on the wall. So I'll use the wall to, again, find this 90-degree position, elbow leverage position. See if I can see it here. And then I'll sit my weight into that pocket, and then I'll extend the inside leg forward. So I just kind of feel around, because at first, sensing where the elbow needs to go is the biggest limitation. We often get into the position and wonder why we can't do it immediately. It's not going to happen. It won't happen. I have to get comfortable building this sense of placement. And that initial organization or coordination, however you want to think about it, is the first layer to any movement. Have to understand and feel and sense what needs to happen. So once I've spent some time, and again, I'll do this daily, 20 to 30 seconds on the wall or so, maybe a few rounds, I'll start to play around with these progressions on the floor. And generally doing it from a squat, I'll start in my basic resting squat position, and hands generally go a little wider than the feet. This is another common mistake that people make. The depth or the reach of the hands is important, because eventually when we get into some of these later progressions and variations of the QDR, we're actually taking the head in a circle around or in between the hands. So if I am too narrow in placement, it changes my center of mass a little bit, as well as it blocks me from being able to rotate into that rotated position. So for example, if my hand's wide enough, I can pull the head through. If it's here, I'm going to get blocked by the hand. And it, over time, does affect how I practice the QDR, meaning if I practice like this with the hands close, sure, I might still find some points of balance and it's interesting. But then when I get into actually being able to assist in these other progressions, or I want to use it inside of something like locomotion, I don't have the hand awareness and the placement awareness to actually make the thing happen. So basically, you do it right the first time. Hands a little wider. So I'll come in and I'll actually play around with, 10 to 20 to sometimes even 30-second holds in this gathered position. So I'll gather, I'll stack the knees, I'll stack the ankles, and I'll just let the head hang out. Very light weight in the head, and I'm really focusing on bringing the attention into this hand and finding the connection into this first knuckle, really rooting that into the floor. So again, building more felt sense. For some, this might be where you stop. This is where you need to do the work and you build up the quality from there. Essentially, moving onward is a matter of changing the variable of the load by either lifting the feet, the head, or both, and then starting to spread out the legs and build this this rideability of the balance point. And there is a bit of a strength element to it, but it's not as much strength as most people eventually find or eventually arrive at. So at first, those that are more oriented towards strength are obviously going to use way too much strength to make it happen. That was me. I learned many lessons along the way in that. Generally, strength gets us in trouble if we're not aware or we're not sensing what needs to happen within the movement. So that's why, again, I'll even go back to even my own practice wrapping up here. I'll go back to sensing. I want to feel it. So as that, again, starts to feel better and it's possible, what I can do next is with the head on the ground, lift the feet. With the feet off the ground, lift the head. And then go into a scissor position. Now, with this scissor split position, the bottom leg is going forward, the top leg is going back. This is something you can play around with. It translates, again, later into other patterns that are usable in something like, let's say, locomotion, where maybe I'm using the QDR as an exit, and I need that back leg to wrap and pull me around into whatever the next thing I'm going to do. So, again, we keep going through these layers. We figure out where we're at. Eventually, maybe we can start to pull the fingers off the ground and work this single arm QDR stuff and find some points of balance there. Again, the key to the QDR, doing it, just like anything else. The roadblock to the QDR, not doing it, just like anything else. Consistency rules here. This is something that when I was really practicing the QDR heavy, I was doing 3 to 4 days a week, depending on how the wrist felt. So the wrist might be the limitation, but remember, in this practice, we want to expose the limitations. So the wrist telling us that it's an issue is actually a good thing, because it's going to up our possibilities in other areas, maybe hand balancing, soft acrobatic work, or just feeling good in the wrist, not having elbow pain when I pull or do something that I want to be able to do without pain. So it informs our practice. It tells us where we need to spend more time, and it becomes this workable tool that we can insert in a way that makes sense for us from a consistency standpoint, so that we're making progress, but we're not, going on to the other side of pain, which would be building some long-term issues, building in or settling in with injury in some form or capacity. So, said another way, don't do it if it hurts. Regularly find an option to help improve whatever that thing that's getting exposed is. But doing this work 3 to 4 times a week, 2 to 5 sets, again, depending on where you're at in your practice, these are general recommendations or general thoughts. I might do this maybe twice a week now, just to kind of hone in on where my balance is, and just to check in to these layers that don't get touched as often. As far as the other common limitations outside of consistency is the grindiness of the work. Generally, it's not consistent because it's challenging. This is not easy work. It can feel very grindy, and with anything that's hard and difficult, tends to be the case that people generally don't do it. So I think it speaks for itself. If you made it to this part of the video, you're likely interested in doing this work. So starting on that path a couple days a week and adding some of these elements in, tinker with them, see what happens. Again, thought I'd share at the end of the session here. I'd like to do more of these, just expose and explore different areas of practice and common thoughts about practice. So drop me a line, let me know what you think about it.